The indie space is often one that I go back to find something new, or a new game that is a throwback to a style of games from my childhood. And while not everyone ends up being a hit, nothing is better than when you get to try something that both pays tribute to an older style of games, while feeling very fresh. Easy Trigger Games is one such developer. They are made up of talented people who were heavily influenced by 80s action movies, along with the more retro arcade titles. Their goal was to create a side-scrolling shooter drenched in 80s cinema. Join me as we take a look back at Huntdown. In 2016, two game developers wanted to start their own company and make a completely new game. One of them had been making CD-ROM games for Swedish television, along with working on an MMO. The other had experience with graphical design and music. The two of them founded Easy Trigger Games and hired 4 more developers. Easy Trigger Games looked at the gaming space and saw a lack of arcade shooter-focused titles, so they wanted to try and make one. Their main inspiration came from their youth as they discussed games and movies that they enjoyed. As the idea began to take form, the team began listing out features that were present in games that they liked to include in their own game. To test out if this conceptual idea could work, they made a prototype, and this is where Huntdown was born. The team wanted to blend the aesthetics of the 80s into a run-and-gun arcade action game. The setting for the action would be presented in a future where everyone is in danger. The police are powerless to stop the gangs ruling the streets. The Huntdown would be a place where it was almost medieval while also being drenched in 80s action movie visual design. The player would take control of one of 3 bounty hunters to try and bring law and order back to the city.
In the 21st century, nations have collapsed. From the ruins of war arise a society fueled by greed. Profiteering mega corporations provide protection and jobs to anyone who abides by their policies. The alternative, a criminal path. Street gangs engage in a constant power struggle against rival gangs and authorities. But there are some that have no interest in gang affiliations nor company citizenship. They only pledge allegiance to the highest bidder. Their title, Bounty Hunter. Their only objective, hunt down.
The Huntdown would take on both the gameplay and visual design of a 16-bit side-scroller. The goal of the game would be to neutralize gangs, and would be divided into areas being broken up into individual levels. The player would defeat gang members to reach the leader to take out the gang for good. The enemies would have their own unique characteristics from the visual design, weapons, along with how they fought the player. Local 2-player co-op would be an integral component of the experience, especially with the goal to create the desired arcade-like feel. The setting and visuals were rooted in 80s action cinema like Escape from New York and The Warriors. The gameplay influences came from a variety of games from the developers' youth. They cited games like Final Fight, Sunset Riders, Doom, Quake, among many others as their influences. The player would choose between one of 3 bounty hunters and engage in plenty of shootouts. There would be a lot of run-and-gun action, but the developers wanted to include the option of being able to duck behind cover. This meant that the player could hide behind objects along with hiding in the background areas that are indicated with the shadows. The purpose was to provide the players with options depending on the situation. The developers had a goal to create an arcade game that almost anyone could pick up and play, while providing a game that was a tribute to an era that was special to the studio. Now they wanted to balance the game, making their game approachable and easy to understand, while also providing a meaningful challenge to the player. This resulted in the studio implementing different difficulty options, along with well-placed checkpoints to keep the action punishing yet fair. The 6-person studio sites at their greatest challenge with Huntdown was how they couldn't realistically implement every idea they had into this game. This resulted in the developers cutting ideas for levels, bosses, weapons, and more to ensure a more focused final release. Huntdown was shaping up to be a love letter of sorts to the 80s. It paid tribute to the 80s action cinema while rooting its gameplay in a side-scrolling co-op arcade game. This new studio had the humble goal of paying respect to influential aspects of their childhood while taking the risk on a completely new and original IP. In May 2020, Huntdown was released to the world. The Huntdown is a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up game that takes a lot of inspiration from the Metal Slug series, while being heavily inspired by the 80s in its visual design and soundtrack. The action is generally a nice mix of challenging and fun. While in single-player, the game could use a bit more refinement and balancing, but as a co-op game, this game is really good. The Huntdown is a solid co-op side-scroller, with a healthy dose of 80s aesthetics, humor, and most of all, very fun. The Huntdown's action is centered around the side-scrolling shooting. It is all about forward-moving momentum. The shooting is a nice mix of run and gun and staying back and using cover. You can hide behind many waist-high objects. These can also be destroyed, so while the cover can help you safely thin the herd, it cannot take a lot of shots until it's gone, or one grenade can usually take it out. But cover is not your only means for defense. You can also dodge to quickly sidestep enemy attacks. The controls are rather simple as you focus on shooting everything that comes at you, and doing your best to dodge the enemy fire. Both the sound effects and impact from your shots are good and satisfying. The Huntdown has distinct and quality sounds for each of the guns, along with having a healthy dose of blood from the hits and over-the-top dismemberment from certain guns and explosives. This is an easy to pick up side-scroller that is great to play in co-op.
It's only physics.
You can select between 3 different bounty hunters. Each one has their own unique pistol that never runs out of ammo, along with a distinct throwable. One throws several knives, whereas another character throws a boomerang, allowing for 2 chances to hit one enemy. While in the levels, enemies will often drop weapons for you to pick up. The game has a large amount of different weapons like SMGs, shotguns, rifles, explosives, and many more. I really like how each area in the game has a set of different weapons to use. This means that you will always have something new to play with, along with this contributing to the identity of each area. For example, the first area has a pump shotgun, while the second has a sawed-off shotgun. And to the game's credit, the weapons are not just visually varied, but act and operate uniquely. The level objectives are rather simple: take everyone out, find all of the secrets, and defeat the boss. One of Huntdown's best aspects are the frequent checkpoints. Even on the normal difficulty, this game can be very challenging. The checkpoints are well done in that you can slowly chip away at a level if you're having a hard time. The Huntdown has great pacing as well. The levels are well planned and executed from their duration. They never feel like they go on for too long, and are never too short to feel like they end right when they're just getting started. The brisk nature of them gives you that feeling of satisfaction as you beat the levels in each area. Huntdown comes with 2 modes, the story mode and arcade mode. The arcade mode ignores the cutscenes and has you picking up additional items to increase your score. Essentially, it's a nice way to jump back into the game for some quick action. I do want to make note that the core gameplay is what will keep you coming back to this title. It never gets old to shoot the variety of enemies, and the liberal dismemberment and blood only adds to it. This also shows how Huntdown understands what makes these retro games so special, and it is a good example that if your core gameplay loop is good, it will naturally push you back into playing the game over and over again.
Look alive! It's not personal.
You don't know who you're messing with.
Explosion coming up. Before you...
The game is divided into a few areas, with each one having a few levels. In addition, each area has a unique set of enemies along with weapons you can pick up. The gangs range from a stereotypical 80s movie gang to one consisting of a hockey team. Levels have decent visual variety, from fighting on city streets, subways, sewers, and more. The amount of different boss fights is pretty impressive. Each one has something unique about them that you need to learn to defeat them. This can consist of completely different forms for the bosses, or changing up their tactics towards the end of the fight. For example, you will fight a lifter that tries to melee you, and in his second form he will throw weights at you. Others have situations where the fight completely changes, like one of the hockey bosses. At first he starts off stationary, and once all of his armor is gone, the boss will become more mobile. Some of the bosses can be a bit cheap, but I generally enjoyed these fights and was impressed by how they continually kept you guessing. For example, the flamethrower boss has a second form where he is on fire, and he will just keep running around. This can be a bit annoying since he moves rather fast, but thankfully in a set pattern. But you also need to dodge debris from the ceiling that can easily hit you. In other situations, the placement of enemies and their weapons can feel rather cheap, like proxy mines and rocket launchers. These parts very much show how this game was made in balance for 2 players. I played this in both single player and in co-op, and while I had fun in single player, the game is way better in co-op. While in co-op you can revive your partner. If one of you loses all of your health, you have a set amount of time to get to your partner. So this adds a risk and reward mechanic, adding more tension to the gameplay that is not present while in single player. Co-op feels essential for many of the boss fights, where you can divide and conquer. I do think that Huntdown could work better in single player. It just needs more tweaking and balancing. While the core gameplay carries the game very well, I do think that a few additional modes could have increased the amount of content here. For example, I think a boss rush mode would fit in perfectly, with how many unique bosses there are, along with a horde mode. Before we move to the conclusion, I want to mention the presentation and music. The Huntdown has a fun and light story with decent mission briefings, and a good introduction to set the stage for the action. The game is full of funny one-liners from famous 80s movies, along with plenty of Easter eggs from 80s action films. The game looks good, but it sounds even better. The music does most of the heavy lifting for the presentation and effectively fuels the action very well. Here are a few tracks from the game. The Huntdown successfully shows that it understands what made these retro side-scrollers so great, while creating something new that doesn't just solely rely on the nostalgia. The core action is fun, challenging, and great. The weapons are satisfying to shoot, and it never gets old to take out your opposition. The visuals enhance the game, with the soundtrack appropriately feeding into the action, and contributing to the overall identity of the game. While Huntdown is fun in single player, it is at its best while in co-op. You have more options while playing with a friend as well. And lastly, the game is impressive as a new developer's first game. Something else I want to make note of is that I hope this game sold well enough, because I found out that during the development the studio had to cut many ideas from the final game, but they saved most of them for a potential sequel. With the winning formula of this game and ideas for new features, I would love to see a sequel. As a co-op game, I highly recommend the Huntdown. If you are interested in being notified of new videos, please hit the subscribe button and bell. And if you would like to support the channel and get early access to content, please check out my Patreon. All of the links will be at the end of this video and within the description. And thank you very much for watching.